How to let God take control when fear takes over. Fear does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like a whisper, quiet enough to seem reasonable, familiar enough to feel safe. At first, it sounds like caution. Then it becomes preparation. Before you notice, it has turned into a constant voice narrating everything that could go wrong. Your body stays tense, even when nothing is happening. Your mind runs ahead, while your soul lags behind, tired and overwhelmed. You try to manage it by thinking harder, praying faster, holding tighter. But fear is never satisfied. It always asks for more control, more certainty, more effort. And somewhere in the middle of all that striving, a painful realization surfaces. You are exhausted, not because life is heavy, but because you are carrying what you were never meant to carry alone. This is where the real question begins. Not how to eliminate fear, but how to stop letting fear decide who is in charge. Because the moment fear takes the wheel, peace quietly steps out of the car. And unless something changes, fear will keep driving you further away from the rest your soul desperately needs. When fear becomes the loudest voice, fear rarely announces itself as fear. It arrives disguised as concern, responsibility, and preparation. It sounds reasonable at first, even helpful. It tells you to be careful, to think ahead, to stay alert. But over time, that voice grows louder and more persistent. It stops advising and starts directing. It becomes the narrator of your inner life, explaining every situation through the lens of what could go wrong. You begin to wake up already tense, as if something bad is waiting just outside the door. Nothing has happened yet, but your body is already bracing. Your mind is already running. Fear has learned how to speak in your own tone, using your own thoughts, until it feels like wisdom instead of anxiety. As fear becomes the loudest voice, it slowly reshapes how you experience reality. The present moment loses its weight because your attention is always pulled toward an imagined future. You replay conversations that have not even happened. You rehearse explanations, defenses, and worst-case scenarios. Peace feels irresponsible because fear has convinced you that vigilance is the only thing standing between you and disaster. Even moments meant for rest are interrupted by a low hum of unease. Your shoulders stay tight. Your breathing stays shallow. Your heart stays on guard. Fear trains your nervous system to believe that calm is dangerous and control is safety. What makes this so powerful is that fear does not feel evil. It feels necessary. It tells you that if you stop worrying, you will be caught off guard. If you stop planning, you will fail. If you stop controlling, everything will fall apart. Slowly, fear replaces trust with tension. Instead of listening for God's quiet guidance, you start listening for internal alarms. Instead of asking what God is doing, you focus on what you must prevent. Your spiritual life does not disappear, but it changes shape. Prayer becomes urgent and strained, filled with pressure rather than peace. You are not resting in God's presence. You are asking Him to reinforce your defenses. Fear also changes how you see yourself. It convinces you that your worth is tied to your ability to manage outcomes. If something goes wrong, you assume you missed something, failed to anticipate something, did not pray hard enough, or think far enough ahead. You carry responsibility that was never meant to rest on human shoulders, and because fear is relentless, you rarely feel like you have done enough. There is always one more scenario to consider, one more problem to solve, one more possibility to fear. This creates a quiet exhaustion that seeps into your soul. You are tired, but you do not know how to rest. You are overwhelmed, but you feel guilty admitting it. Fear thrives in that silence, because silence without trust becomes a breeding ground for worry. Over time, fear crowds out your sensitivity to God, not because God has withdrawn, but because fear has filled every available space. God's voice is gentle, steady, and patient. Fear is loud, urgent, and demanding. When fear dominates, everything feels immediate, everything feels critical. Everything feels like it cannot wait, and in that constant urgency, you lose the ability to discern what truly matters. Decisions are made from pressure instead of prayer. Reactions replace reflection. You are constantly responding, rarely listening. Yet beneath all this noise, there is something deeper happening. A quiet resistance within your soul, a longing for stillness, a desire to stop striving, a hunger for peace that fear can never satisfy. The truth is, fear became loud because you were trying to protect something you love, your future, your family, your heart, your faith. That instinct is not wrong, but fear is a poor guide. It promises safety but delivers anxiety. It promises control but produces exhaustion. And the moment you begin to recognize fear as a voice rather than a truth, something shifts. You realize that not every thought deserves your agreement. Not every feeling deserves authority. Fear may speak loudly, but it does not have the right to decide who leads your life. That realization is not yet surrender, but it is the doorway to it. Because before God takes control, you must first notice what has been controlling you, and that awareness prepares your heart for the deeper truth that comes next. The difference between awareness and obsession. There is a quiet but crucial line between being aware and being consumed, and fear blurs that line until you can no longer tell the difference. Awareness is the ability to notice what is happening without losing yourself in it. Obsession is when your thoughts circle the same concern so tightly that nothing else can enter. Fear convinces you that obsession is wisdom. It tells you that thinking about a problem over and over again is the same as preparing for it. But preparation has limits. Obsession has none. Awareness allows you to respond when needed. Obsession keeps you trapped in constant anticipation, living mentally in moments that may never arrive. When fear is present, awareness quietly shifts into fixation. You start scanning your life for signs of trouble. A tone of voice feels threatening, a delay feels ominous, a small change feels like a warning. Your mind fills in gaps with imagined conclusions, and those conclusions feel just real enough to disturb your peace. You are no longer simply informed, you are internally entangled. Fear does not need facts to grow, it feeds on possibility. And the more space you give it, the more it demands. What began as concern becomes a habit of overthinking, and that habit slowly erodes your sense of safety. This is where many people feel confused spiritually. They believe they are being responsible, discerning, or cautious, when in reality they are being driven by fear. Awareness keeps you grounded in the present. Obsession pulls you into a future you cannot control. Awareness invites prayer. Obsession replaces prayer with rumination. Instead of bringing your concerns to God and releasing them, you keep rehearsing them, turning them over again and again, hoping clarity will emerge. But clarity rarely comes from obsession. It usually comes from stillness, and stillness is exactly what fear tries to keep you from. Obsession also creates a false sense of importance. Fear makes every thought feel urgent, every scenario feel critical. It tells you that if you stop thinking about the problem, something bad will happen. This keeps your nervous system activated, your body tense, your spirit restless. Even when you are physically at rest, your mind keeps working, sleep becomes shallow, silence becomes uncomfortable. Peace feels suspicious. Fear has trained you to believe that calm is dangerous, that vigilance is the price of safety. Over time, this takes a toll, not just emotionally, but spiritually. Your heart grows weary, your trust grows thin, your faith feels distant, not because you stopped believing, but because you stopped resting. God invites awareness, not obsession. Awareness acknowledges reality without surrendering hope. It notices fear without obeying it. Obsession, on the other hand, slowly replaces trust with control. It shifts your focus inward, away from God's presence and toward your own ability to manage outcomes. This is not a failure of faith. It is a human response to uncertainty. But it is not where peace lives. Peace lives where trust is allowed to breathe. Peace lives where you can say, "This matters, but it is not mine to carry alone." Recognizing the difference between awareness and obsession is a turning point. It allows you to gently interrupt the cycle without condemning yourself. You begin to notice when your thoughts are no longer serving you. You realize that staying mentally stuck is not the same as being faithful. You learn that you can acknowledge risk without surrendering peace, and you can face uncertainty without letting it dominate your inner world. This awareness creates space, and in that space, something important begins to happen. You become open again, open to listening, open to trusting, open to releasing what you have been gripping too tightly. That openness prepares your heart for the deeper issue beneath fear, the belief that control is the same as safety, and that is where the journey continues. Why the need for control feels like survival. The need for control often feels less like a choice and more like a necessity. When fear rises, control steps in pretending to be protection. It tells you that if you can just manage every detail, anticipate every outcome, and stay one step ahead, you will be safe. Control feels active. It feels responsible. It gives you something to do with your fear. But beneath that sense of action is a deeper motive. Control feels like survival because uncertainty feels threatening to the human heart. When the future feels unstable, control becomes a way to anchor yourself, even if that anchor is heavy and exhausting. Fear and control form a quiet partnership. Fear points out everything that could go wrong, and control promises to prevent it. Together, they create the illusion that peace is something you earn through effort. The more uncertain life feels, the tighter your grip becomes. You monitor conversations, outcomes, emotions, and even God's timing. You tell yourself that letting go would be irresponsible, that surrender would mean giving up. But control does not actually remove fear. It only keeps it busy, and the busier fear becomes, the less space there is for trust to grow. This is where control slowly replaces dependence on God, not out of rebellion, but out of habit. You begin to rely more on your own vigilance than on God's presence. You believe that if you stop managing everything, things will fall apart. And so you keep holding on. You hold on to plans, expectations, outcomes, and timelines. Even prayer can become another form of control, where you are not seeking God's will, but asking Him to support yours. The heart posture shifts subtly. God becomes someone you consult, not someone you trust with the outcome. Control also reshapes how you experience faith. Faith begins to feel risky, while control feels sensible. Waiting on God feels passive, while taking matters into your own hands feels strong. But control comes with a hidden cost. It keeps your body tense, your mind overworked, and your spirit restless. You are always preparing for what might happen, rarely enjoying what is happening. The present moment becomes something to manage rather than something to receive. Joy feels fragile. Rest feels unsafe. Peace feels temporary. Control demands constant attention because the moment you loosen your grip, fear rushes back in to remind you of what you cannot guarantee. What makes control so convincing is that it often works in small ways. You plan something and it goes well. You anticipate a problem and you avoid it. These moments reinforce the belief that control equals safety. But eventually, life presents something you cannot manage, an outcome you cannot influence, a season you cannot fix. And when that happens, control turns against you. It tells you that you should have done more, thought harder, tried longer. Instead of protecting you, it blames you. The very thing you relied on for safety becomes a source of shame and self-criticism. God never designed control to be the foundation of peace. Control may create order, but it cannot create rest. Rest requires trust, and trust requires the humility to admit that some things are beyond your reach. This does not mean you stop making wise decisions or taking responsibility. It means you stop carrying the emotional weight of outcomes that were never yours to secure. Letting go of control feels dangerous at first because fear has convinced you that control is all that stands between you and chaos. But in reality, control has been standing between you and peace. The moment you begin to question your need for control, something important shifts. You realize that survival does not come from managing everything perfectly. It comes from being held, from trusting that even when you do not see the path ahead, you are not walking it alone. Control tightens your fists, trust opens your hands, and until your hands are open, you will never be able to receive what God is trying to give you. This realization prepares your heart for the next truth, one that challenges one of the deepest fears beneath control, the fear that God's silence means He is absent. God's silence is not absence. One of the most unsettling experiences when fear takes over is the feeling that God has gone quiet. You pray, but nothing seems to change. You wait, but no clear answer arrives. In that silence, fear begins to interpret the absence of noise as the absence of care. It tells you that if God were truly present, things would feel clearer, lighter, more controlled. But silence has never meant abandonment in the language of faith. God's silence is not a withdrawal. It is often an invitation into deeper trust, one that does not depend on constant reassurance. Fear thrives in silence because it rushes to fill the gaps. When God does not speak the way you expect, fear steps in and narrates its own story. It tells you that you have been overlooked, that you are on your own, that you must now take matters into your own hands. This is where many people tighten their grip on control, believing they cannot afford to wait. But waiting has always been part of how God works. Waiting stretches trust. It exposes what you rely on when answers are delayed. Silence reveals whether your peace was rooted in God's presence or in predictable outcomes. God often works beneath the surface where fear cannot see. Silence creates space, not emptiness. It quiets the noise of constant instruction so that something deeper can take shape within you. In silence, faith moves from being supported by signs to being sustained by trust. This is uncomfortable because it feels vulnerable. You are no longer leaning on certainty. You are leaning on character. You are learning to trust who God is, not just what He does. Fear resists this kind of trust because it cannot control it. Fear wants clarity before obedience. God invites obedience before clarity. Silence also confronts your expectations of how God should act. You may expect immediate direction, quick relief, or visible intervention. When those expectations are not met, fear interprets it as neglect. But God's timing is rarely about speed. It is about formation. He is shaping your heart to hold what is coming. Silence strengthens spiritual muscles that certainty never develops. It teaches patience, resilience, and humility. It teaches you to listen differently, not for instructions, but for presence. God is often most present when He feels most hidden. Fear assumes that if God is silent, something is wrong. But throughout Scripture, silence often precedes transformation. It appears before breakthroughs, before callings, before deliverance. Silence is where trust is tested and refined. It is where you learn to remain steady without constant confirmation. God's silence is not a test of your worth. It is an invitation to grow in confidence that He is near, even when He is quiet. The more you learn to sit with God in silence, the less power fear has over you. Silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling safe. You begin to realize that God does not need to speak constantly to be involved. His presence does not fluctuate with your emotions. His care does not depend on your ability to hear Him clearly. And as that realization settles in, something begins to loosen. The urge to control softens. The panic to act immediately fades. Silence becomes a place of rest rather than threat. This shift prepares you for a deeper understanding of surrender. Because once you stop interpreting silence as abandonment, you can begin to see surrender not as weakness, but as trust. And that changes everything about how you respond to fear. The moment surrender stops being weakness. Surrender often carries a negative weight in our minds. It sounds like defeat, like giving up, like admitting failure. When fear is present, surrender feels especially dangerous because fear tells you that letting go means losing control and exposing yourself to harm. But true surrender is not passive resignation. It is an intentional decision to stop carrying what was never meant to be held by human strength alone. Surrender begins the moment you realize that your effort, no matter how sincere, cannot produce the peace your soul is craving. Fear convinces you that surrender will make you vulnerable, but the truth is, fear already has you vulnerable. It has kept you tense, alert, and exhausted. Surrender does not increase risk. It simply acknowledges reality. It admits that you are finite, that your vision is limited, that your strength has boundaries. This admission is not weakness, it is honesty, and honesty is the foundation of trust. When you surrender, you are not stepping into the unknown alone. You are placing what you cannot manage into the hands of a God who sees what you cannot. The turning point comes when surrender shifts from being something you resist to something you choose. Not because circumstances have improved, but because continuing to control everything has become too heavy. You reach a point where holding on costs more than letting go. In that moment, surrender stops being an abstract spiritual idea and becomes a deeply practical act. It sounds like a quiet internal decision. I cannot keep doing this on my own. I trust God more than I trust my fear. That decision may not remove fear immediately, but it removes fear's authority. Surrender also changes how you relate to God. Instead of approaching him with a list of demands or solutions, you come with open hands. You stop trying to convince God to act and start allowing him to lead. This does not mean you stop caring or stop hoping. It means you stop insisting that peace must come through your control. You begin to trust that God's care for your life is deeper than your ability to manage it. That trust creates space for rest, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer carrying everything alone. Fear tells you that surrender will leave you unprotected. God shows you that surrender places you under his care. Fear pushes you to act prematurely. God invites you to wait with confidence. Fear demands certainty. God offers presence. When surrender stops being weakness, it becomes strength rooted in trust rather than effort. It becomes the courage to stand still when fear demands motion. It becomes the confidence to rest when fear insists on striving. This shift does not happen all at once. Surrender is often practiced in small, quiet decisions. Choosing not to replay a scenario one more time. Choosing to rest instead of ruminate. Choosing to trust God with today instead of worrying about tomorrow. Each choice weakens fear's grip and strengthens your capacity for peace. Over time, surrender becomes less about giving something up and more about receiving something better. When surrender stops being weakness, you begin to experience a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom of having everything under control, but the freedom of knowing you are held. And that freedom prepares your heart for the next step in this journey, learning how to walk forward in obedience even when fear has not fully disappeared. Learning to obey before you feel safe. One of the hardest truths about faith is that obedience often comes before comfort. Fear tells you to wait until you feel ready, calm, and confident before taking a step forward. God invites you to move while your heart is still trembling. This tension is where many people get stuck. They believe that peace must come first and action second. But in the life of faith, peace is often the result of obedience, not the requirement for it. Obedience is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to trust God's direction even when fear is still speaking. Fear demands emotional certainty. It wants guarantees before it allows you to move. God rarely provides guarantees in the way fear asks for them. Instead, He offers guidance one step at a time. This requires a different kind of courage, not the courage that feels strong, but the courage that moves despite weakness. Obedience in moments of fear feels risky because it exposes how little control you actually have. You are no longer waiting for circumstances to feel safe. You are trusting God to be faithful as you move forward. This kind of obedience reshapes your understanding of safety. Safety is no longer defined by predictability or control. It is defined by alignment with God's will. When you obey, even while afraid, something subtle begins to change. Your focus shifts from managing outcomes to following direction. Fear loses its grip, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer in charge. You are no longer asking fear for permission to act. You are responding to God's invitation instead. Obedience also teaches you to listen differently. Fear speaks in urgency and extremes. God's guidance is often quieter, clearer, and more grounded. It does not rush you, but it does move you. Learning to obey before you feel safe means learning to trust that God's leading is more reliable than your emotions. Emotions fluctuate. God's faithfulness does not. This does not mean you ignore your feelings. It means you do not let them determine your direction. Many people wait for fear to disappear before they act, only to find themselves standing still for years. Obedience breaks that cycle. It creates movement where fear created paralysis. It builds confidence, not by removing uncertainty, but by proving that God meets you in motion. Each step of obedience becomes evidence that you are not alone, that you are supported, that you are guided. Over time, trust grows not from feeling safe, but from seeing God show up consistently. Obedience does not always change your circumstances immediately. Sometimes the situation remains difficult, unclear, or uncomfortable, but something within you begins to settle. You are no longer fighting against reality. You are cooperating with God's work in your life. This cooperation brings a quiet strength, a steadiness that fear cannot replicate. You begin to realize that obedience itself is a form of surrender, one that places your life in God's hands while you keep walking forward. As you learn to obey before you feel safe, fear gradually loses its authority. It may still speak, but it no longer decides. And in that shift, you become open to a deeper kind of peace, one that does not depend on circumstances changing, but on God's presence being enough. That realization leads into the next truth, the discovery that God often restores peace long before He changes the situation itself. How God restores peace without changing circumstances. One of the most surprising truths in the spiritual life is that God often restores peace before He changes anything around you. Fear convinces you that peace is the reward at the end of the struggle, something you earn once the problem is solved. But God works differently. He meets you in the middle of uncertainty, not after it disappears. Peace, in God's economy, is not dependent on resolution. It is rooted in relationship. This is why peace can exist even when answers are still missing and outcomes remain unclear. Fear tells you that calm will come when life settles down. God offers calm while life is still unsettled. This kind of peace does not deny reality. It coexists with difficulty. It does not silence questions, but it quiets the panic behind them. When God restores peace without changing circumstances, He is reshaping your inner world. He is teaching your heart that safety does not come from predictability, but from His presence. This peace feels different. It is not the relief of escape. It is the steadiness of trust. This peace begins internally. Your thoughts slow down, your breathing deepens, your body starts to release the tension it has been holding. Nothing outside may have shifted yet, but something within has. You stop bracing for impact. You stop rehearsing disaster. You begin to experience moments of rest, even while uncertainty remains. This is not denial, it is alignment. Your heart is learning to rest where your circumstances cannot. God restores peace by changing what fear has distorted. Fear magnifies threats and minimizes God's nearness. Peace reverses that. It does not remove the problem, but it restores perspective. You begin to see that fear has been demanding your attention while God has been offering His presence. Peace redirects your focus. It gently draws you back to what is stable and eternal rather than what is volatile and temporary. This shift does not require effort, it requires openness. Peace is received, not achieved. This kind of peace also strengthens resilience. When peace is present, you are no longer driven by urgency. You can wait without panic. You can make decisions without pressure. You can respond rather than react. Fear thrives on haste. Peace invites patience, and patience creates space for wisdom. God restores peace, not just to make you feel better, but to prepare you to live better within uncertainty. It is important to understand that peace does not mean the absence of emotion. You may still feel concern, sadness, or uncertainty, but those emotions no longer dominate your inner world. They no longer dictate your choices. Peace becomes the atmosphere in which everything else exists. This is why peace can coexist with unanswered prayers and unresolved situations. It is anchored deeper than circumstances. When God restores peace without changing circumstances, He is reminding you of something essential. Your life is not held together by outcomes. It is held together by His faithfulness, and that faithfulness does not waver with circumstances. As this truth settles in, fear loses its grip. It no longer needs to be fought. It simply fades into the background as peace takes its place. That realization prepares your heart for the final truth, the moment when control shifts fully and fear loses its authority altogether. When God takes control, fear loses its authority. There is a moment, often quiet and almost unnoticed, when control changes hands. It is not marked by sudden certainty or dramatic relief. It is marked by rest. You realize that fear is still present, but it is no longer directing your life. It may speak, but it no longer decides. This is what happens when God takes control. Fear loses its authority, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer trusted as a guide. You stop asking fear what to do and start trusting God with where you are going. When God takes control, your relationship with fear changes. Fear becomes information, not instruction. It may alert you, but it does not command you. You learn to acknowledge it without obeying it. This shift does not come from effort or discipline alone. It comes from trust built over time. Trust formed through surrender, obedience, waiting, and peace. Each step along the way weakens fear's claim on your heart and strengthens your confidence in God's care. This change brings a new kind of freedom, not the freedom of having everything figured out, but the freedom of no longer needing to. You stop living as if everything depends on you. You stop measuring your faith by how calm you feel or how well things are going. Instead, your confidence rests in God's character. You know that even if the path is unclear, you are guided. Even if the outcome is uncertain, you are held. Even if fear returns, it does not rule. When fear loses its authority, your inner world becomes steadier. Decisions are no longer driven by panic. Waiting no longer feels like wasting time. Rest no longer feels irresponsible. You begin to trust that God is at work even when you cannot see progress. This trust does not remove challenges, but it transforms how you face them. You move through difficulty with a grounded heart rather than a frantic one. This is not a one-time victory. Fear may try to reclaim control in moments of stress or uncertainty, but each time you choose trust over control, fear's influence weakens. Surrender becomes a posture rather than an event. Trust becomes a rhythm rather than a struggle. You learn to return again and again to the truth that God is faithful and present. The deepest peace comes not from a life without fear, but from a life where fear no longer leads. When God takes control, peace is no longer fragile. It is sustained. It carries you through uncertainty, not around it, and in that place you discover something profound. You were never meant to carry the weight of control. You were meant to walk in trust. Tonight, fear does not get the final word. God does. If you have made it this far, it is not by accident. Something in you was looking for rest, not answers. Looking for reassurance, not explanations. Fear may still be present, but it no longer has to define this moment. Right now, you are breathing. Right now, you are here. And right now, God is closer than your thoughts, steadier than your emotions, more faithful than your fears. You do not need to solve everything tonight. You do not need to have clarity about tomorrow. You only need to remember who is holding you now. Let this be the moment you loosen your grip, not because everything makes sense, but because you trust the one who does. Let God carry what has been weighing on your mind. Let him hold the questions you cannot answer, the outcomes you cannot control, the fears you cannot silence on your own. Peace does not come from understanding everything. It comes from knowing you are not alone in anything. As you step away from this moment, do not rush back into worry. Take this calm with you. Return to it when fear tries to speak louder again. Trust is not built in one decision, but in many small returns. Each time you choose rest over panic, each time you choose faith over control, each time you remember that God is present, even when nothing around you has changed. If this message met you where you are, stay connected. Subscribe as a way of continuing this journey of faith and peace together. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment, not to explain anything, but simply as a quiet prayer, a word, or even a single thought. Sometimes naming what we are carrying is the first step toward letting it go. Tonight, you can rest. Not because fear is gone, but because God is here, and that is enough. And that is